I'm Tom King. I'm the founder of Toolkit.law, and we're here with Kimberly Mehlman-Orozco, an expert witness and expert in the topics of human trafficking. And as you know, one of our 8 sections in the Toolkit.law CLE webinar for the 80 plus countries with English-based legal systems is the global topic of human trafficking. And Kimberly, we're talking today about how to identify victims in human trafficking. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share my screen and let's jump straight into this as I move the help sheet to this screen. This is a help sheet we developed that we hoped you would comment on and offer some thoughts. Let's go ahead and look straight, Kimberly, at the column in green. When it comes to identifying victims, what are some of the behavioral and psychological indicators that we as legal professionals, as bailiffs in a courtroom, as judges, lawyers, mediators, paralegals, what should we be looking for?
So thank you first for inviting me to comment on this toolkit. I would say that the first thing that your CLE credit takers are going to want to know is that human trafficking is very difficult to identify. It's frequently misidentified, even in courtrooms by legal professionals, including police officers. And the reason being is because it's a clandestine crime. When we talk about human trafficking from an international perspective, we're talking about the Palermo Protocol definition, the UN's definition, which is the use of force, fraud, coercion, deception, or threat for the purpose of exploitation or the exploitation of anyone under the age of 18. So this might look a little different depending on if it's a minor or if it's an adult or if it's sex trafficking or
Ah,
labor trafficking. But generally speaking, looking at this left column, there will be very subtle behavioral and psychological indicators. They're going to be difficult to identify. And oftentimes, victims of trafficking, at least serving as an expert witness, I've seen victims behave like co-conspirators. I've seen victims deny their victimization. I have seen victims sometimes be submissive, sometimes be aggressive. I've seen them yell at law enforcement officers. So there really is, it's difficult to identify. It's very situational. It's very uh, place-based, even by the location and the locality. So in looking at behavioral and psychological indicators, while each of these topics might have some area for you to look further into, it's imperative for you to also talk with your local law enforcement, talk with people who are actually processing cases involving trafficking to see what they're seeing as far as behavior and psychological indicators are
I
concerned.
remember recording one of our other recordings, Kimberly, and another expert said something that pierced me. And I'm a former prosecutor, right? Said human trafficking is profiting off someone else's suffering.
Absolutely. It is a modern form of slavery. It is, and the reason why we have these laws is because we identified a gap, a legal gap, internationally speaking. We had chattel slavery had been abolished. We had forced labor abolished, but this is a form of modern slavery where it's using mental manipulation, coercion, threats to get somebody to an exploitative situation.
And outright violence.
Absolutely.
And outright violence.
Absolutely. And but sometimes it's cyclical violence. So you can see a trafficker engage in violent behaviors 1 second, but then maybe for 6 months not be outwardly aggressive. And that's one of the ways that they're able to coerce and manipulate so many different people. And ostensibly, from the outside looking in, we might not be able to identify just from a cursory glance or from a superficial interaction. And to that effect, one of the things that I did want to mention for behavioral and psychological indicators, it's very important that you look at this from a trauma-informed perspective. So, for example, because someone might not behave consistently, they might not self-identify. Trauma-informed perspective is you're engaging with this person maybe slowly, building a rapport. If you're an attorney, they might not disclose, you might not be able to identify them with that first meeting, but maybe across time, if you're a judge, seeing a defendant multiple times, how they're behaving, what they're doing, having some sort of monitoring to see what's going on in a particular situation where you might suspect trafficking can help lead to identification, because it's very, very rare from one superficial interaction that you'll be able to correctly identify a victim of trafficking.
I love that because we once did another section on trauma informed lawyering. And the comment that came up was You don't see any bruises on that person because of the 20 girls that were being enslaved. They only had to beat, rape, or murder one of them in front of the other 19 for them to learn to stay in line. And then they remember that. And then all of a sudden they start thinking, hey, they're not doing that to me. Maybe my situation is as bad as I thought, right? And yet they've been exposed to the trauma, but they don't have the physical bruises. Maybe
Mhm.
they haven't been sexually violated. Maybe they weren't water tortured or drugged, but they knew what would happen to them because the one victim in their same situation at their same location that they made an example of to train the others to fall in line.
Absolutely. And one more thing to add to that is also coerced co-offending, right? A trafficker will oftentimes get their victim to recruit others or perhaps engage in coerced co-offending to get them in a situation where they can also be in trouble with the legal system. And so that's another way to get compliance of saying, oh, well, you recruited this other individual, or you're using drugs, or you engaged in a robbery, and I'm going to report you to law enforcement and you're going to be held accountable. And that's one of the reasons why, in particular, individuals involved in the commercial sex industry, whether consensually or non-consensually, I mean, they are at risk of different forms of victimization. So that's something to look into.
We've got about 3 minutes to finish this column,
Sure.
maybe two. Let's
Okay.
focus on these boxes here that I'm highlighting: the disassociation or flat effect, depression or suicidal thoughts, and sudden behavior changes.
Well, again, these are very subjective. It really is going to depend on the situation. Anyone involved in the legal system, as a profession, they're going to know that they're going to encounter individuals who might have flat affect or depressed or have behavior changes. But I think it's looking at the totality of the circumstances. What is this person being brought in on? How are we encountering them? But also, if in combination, looking at these elements in combination with what was the nature of the encounter. For example, if this person is being brought in on a charge, or if they're involved in the commercial sex industry and they're not financially benefiting from that, and they're also depressed, and they're also having a dissociative or flat effect, it's looking at these elements in combination with the totality of the circumstances. And then just scrolling down a little bit, fear of deportation or legal systems. It's not just that, it is the unreasonable fear. So, for example, the abuse of the legal process is a key element of a potential trafficking situation. So, if an individual you encounter is saying, "Oh well, I was raped or I was sold for sex, but I'm afraid of being deported." I mean, that because my trafficker told me if I report this, I'm going to be in trouble with the authorities. Those are key elements of a potential trafficking situation and something to look at into. And with regards to language limited to industry jargon, there at the back of my book, Hidden in Plain Sight: America's Slaves of the New Millennium, I have an argot of language that's used in the commercial sex industry. So, for example, instead of saying money, they'll say roses or donations. Instead of law enforcement, they'll say Ellie. And there are a number of terms that are used in the commercial sex industry that are suggestive of involvement to that regard, but also, again, just looking at the totality of the circumstances. Are they using this language and they're involved in the commercial sex industry, but they receive no financial benefit and they're essentially a modern slave? Those are the things that you're going to be looking for.
I'm so glad you mentioned your book, and I'm going to put it on the screen right now. Of course, you're commenting not on your help sheet, you're commenting on our help sheet, and we
Yes.
appreciate that, okay? And you're giving your opinions as we kind of just brainstorm on our help sheet, but you ought to be able to see right now. So this is the book that you've put together. So Hidden in Plain Sight: America's Slaves of the New Millennium. You,
Used to train law enforcement as well.
and of course, it'll help when you search on Hidden in Plain Sight and then just add your full name, and it comes right up first on the Google searches that I did in our country. And I highly, you can see how well it's rated. When did you come out with this book?
This is from 2017. I'm actually working on an update to this book, but I think that another thing which is great about your CLEs are continuing education credits constantly evolving your knowledge base and refining the information that you have at your disposal is absolutely key.
So let's go ahead and jump to the second column now, as you and I just kind of brainstorm and freeform over this. So obviously, physical and health indicators are important too. So as a former prosecutor, as a mediator, certainly we as doing intake in a law firm, you could be the legal professional. You could be the bailiff in a courtroom and see something that only a bailiff would notice, right? Because you're behind everybody and no one's looking at you, and you have the chance to listen and see. You're almost invisible as the bailiff in the courtroom, right? Bailiffs are so important. Judges, court staff, right? When you go into the court office to schedule a hearing, perhaps you're a pro se party, which means representing yourself. In whichever the 80 plus countries with English based legal systems, we should be looking for physical abuse, bruises, cuts, burns. Those are things. Malnutrition or dehydration that could be a tool that they use as leverage over victims, or just because of just they don't control their own financial situation, a lack of access to health care, sexually transmitted infections, or forced pregnancies. Any thoughts on these first four boxes that I just highlighted here?
Well, I think you said something that I just want to hone in on. You said see something. So in each of those professions, somebody might see something. The key term that I use in every single training is see something, say something. And yes, you can see lack of access to medical care, but you can also see there's a statistic that says 88% of victims of trafficking encounter a medical health professional during the time of their victimization and are not identified. So they can also present to medical health professionals, but be misidentified because of the clandestine nature of this crime. One of the things I would say for that is also denied access to healthcare. So if they're reporting that somebody had denied their access to healthcare, controlled or using drugs, for example, substance abuse is one of those signs, using drugs to coerce them or keep them complicit. If they had never used drugs before, but all of a sudden they're in this new situation and somebody is feeding them drugs to keep them complicit, that is something to look for. But again, it's very situational. And one of the things that I've noticed is that traffickers can use different tactics for recruitment and control or entrapment and enmeshment depending on their victim. So
And when
depending
you use the word enmeshment, is that where you talk about having the victims be a part of the recruiting?
it's not just part of the recruiting but also enmeshment into their lifestyle, so
Okay.
keeping them into a situation where they are controlled, where they are exploited and almost behave in a way that's complicit to their own exploitation. And so there are a number of journal articles that talk about this, and yes, it can include absolutely these signs, but again, it can be very situational, so you're looking at the totality of the circumstances. One of the things that we also, I see PTSD there. One of the things that we've also noticed is that consenting sex workers and victims of trafficking have PTSD at around the same rate. It's around 60 to 70%. But so again, it's very situational. Poor hygiene, and I think if you scroll down, I thought I saw in this section that you had dental issues, dental neglect. That is absolutely key, because one of the things that I've noticed, and I've written a few peer-reviewed journal articles for dental journals, victims of trafficking often, because of providing fellatio on individuals who have spermicide on prophylactics, it can
Okay.
cause unreasonable or kind of out of characteristic damage to the enamel of their teeth. And so this is something that absolutely you do need to look out for, but it's also very niche and very nuanced. But when I saw that on your toolkit in particular, I was just like, how do they know? Where do they find this information? Because that is something that is very, I don't think, as well publicized as it should be.
And Kimberly, you got to get right. It's toolkit.law. Don't forget the .law.
Yes.
Don't forget the .law. It's branded. But I had never thought or heard of teeth discoloration or dental issues as a giveaway. And of course, the other thing is, if they're meth users, if they're on certain drugs, that also affects the teeth, right?
Correct. Correct.
right?
Which is, again, why it can be difficult to identify, and you're looking at the totality of the circumstances.
Great. Let's go ahead and switch to the second side of the help sheet so we stay on time within
Sure.
30 minutes. Situational and environmental clues. Let's talk about these. A lack of identification or documents, restricted movement, or isolation. Your thoughts on these first three areas?
So, one of the things that I noticed, lack of identification of documents. For me, what that'll look like is typically a confiscation of those documents. So, it's not somebody, willingly relinquishing their document. For example, we see kids that'll travel abroad, and the adult in the class field trip will hold their identification documents for safekeeping, and if they ever want it back, they can get it back. It's not that kind of a situation. It is not something where you're willingly giving it to somebody for safekeeping. It is a situation where it's confiscated and you cannot get it back if you want to. And I think that if you put the toolkit back up, so restricted movement and isolation, absolutely, that's another key one. So again, when we're talking about trafficking from an international perspective in every single country, it is a modern form of slavery. So you're looking at restricted movement with where they're in control of where they're living, their access to healthcare, their ability to communicate with third parties, presence of a controller or a third party, unusual working hours or locations. That one is key as well. So one of the things that I see in trafficking situations is most consistently, because we're talking about modern slavery here, they will have unreasonable and extremely long work hours and work days with few days off. So no sick leave, no vacation time. They're working 7 days per week for 12 to 16 hours a day. They're living in deplorable circumstances. And so unusual working hours or locations, but also not physically receiving the financial benefit from that. So they're not getting any overtime. They're not, gaining money because of that. Debt bondage, exploitative contracts, that is another thing that's key. So again, from an international perspective, the definition of trafficking involves deception for the purpose of exploitation. So if they have a contract, or they're led to believe if they come to a different country, they're going to be making, $100 a day. And then when they arrive here, it's $10 a day or nothing. I
Yeah.
mean, that's key.
Yeah, and so we're continuing down the Toolkit.law help sheet. Let's go ahead and we got through that column rather quickly. So let's go ahead and let's jump to the right side, and then let's just kind of freeform on the other topics that you think you wished we'd included in this Toolkit.law help sheet on human trafficking and identifying victims in this pure evil form of slavery, right? So when we look at screening and interview techniques, we know if we're good prosecutors or we're good defense attorneys, if we have a great intake process, we understand the importance as part of trauma-informed lawyering or paralegaling to build rapport before asking sensitive questions. And and especially if you're of the opposite sex, right? But even if you are the same sex, right? But for a guy to ask a gal some of these questions, depending on their culture, just hearing the question could be, depending on the culture, could be shocking. And with the trauma that you may not even know that they've gone through, you have no idea what triggers when you ask these questions. So building rapport is so important, Kimberly, isn't it?
It is absolutely imperative. And Tom, I mean, just being candid with you, when I reviewed Toolkit.law's when this protocol, this was, I think the best part of it. It's something that I haven't seen in other toolkits. It is something that is absolutely imperative. So building rapport, asking open-ended trauma-informed questions, these are absolutely key. And this is one of the reasons why legal professionals might be in a good situation or a good position to perform this kind of a screening. So trauma-informed interviewing, it does take place over the course of a number of days. One of the things about my background, I've interviewed numerous victims of trafficking, but also human traffickers, as well as consenting sex workers and commercial sex consumers, and asking those open-ended questions like, tell me about your situation, how did you come to work here? Those are absolutely key, and you were able to get information that I think is really helpful with identification, perhaps more helpful than any other form of, checking a box. Do we meet these indicia criteria? Typically, that's not how identification happens. It happens through this open-ended trauma-informed questioning. When you have a feeling, and when you see something that's out of characteristic, it doesn't seem to make sense, and then you start asking for a little bit more information and asking those open-ended trauma-informed questions, that's how identification occurs.
And why do we do help sheets at Toolkit.law? Well, what we learned is lawyers don't want to read a white paper. They're not going to look at a PowerPoint presentation. And most presentations for continuing legal education, they're just looking down at their laptop and doing billable hours work anyway. We found that people needed a quick checklist, a help sheet of the basic boxes to cover, right? The buckets to check off. And a lot of times they're the soft skills, right? It's not a case reference, depending on which of the 80 countries you're in. But when I look at this, as lawyers, we know to ask open-ended questions. But are we thinking of trauma-informed questions? Trauma-informed questions, because so many of us could think, man, this person may have been trafficked. Tell me about your trafficking. Your chances of getting the to the bottom, to the answer that you're looking for, you're killing yourself. You are in a suboptimal professional methodology if you're not thinking trauma informed first, right? So let's
Oh,
talk about.
absolutely. Well, and also just going down that list. So you talk about trauma informed, but you have also in here avoid law enforcement interrogation tactics. Numerous countries have what's called vacator statutes to provide post-conviction relief for erroneously criminalized victims. One of the things that I've seen law enforcement do, which is a misstep, is they'll encounter somebody who they suspect to be a victim, and they'll say, cooperate as a victim, give us the information, or we're going to prosecute you as an offender. That is not the way to go about doing things. And you would be shocked to know the number of victims of trafficking, clear victims of trafficking, who I have seen get deported, who I have seen get convicted of a crime. And that should not occur in any country. And it's imperative that we have correct identification, but also we move forward with a trauma-informed perspective. We treat survivors of trafficking as survivors of trafficking who need assistance, who need services. And that's another key is, connecting them with the right people and places, because as you mentioned, you said if you ask them, are you a trafficked person? If you use the word trafficking, they're not going to self-identify. It's extremely rare. I don't think I've ever seen a case where that occurred. It's more so learning about their situation, asking those open-ended questions, and using your knowledge and your position to do your due diligence to discover, is this situation consistent with modern slavery?
And it just breaks my heart to share that about a year ago, when in the United States, in Houston, in the sixth largest city in North America, we had a domestic violence seminar that I put on. And it turned out one of my good friends who was attending that event had been sex trafficked, had still not learned the English language, and was sex trafficked from age 17 to 21 all around the country. The FBI breaks in, they arrest her, convict her, and send her to prison for 4 years because she couldn't speak English. They didn't give her translation 20 years ago. And that individual to this day has a conviction of being a prostitute, when in fact she was a slave of sex trafficking. And the heartbreak, if you part of the journey of trauma informed lawyering is hearing some of the horrendous stories and being open to those things can happen, even if the right guys show up with the white hats. If law enforcement shows up, you got to make sure that they had a trauma informed approach And what happened 20 years ago or 5 years ago, they weren't even taught the same things 5 years ago, right, Kimberly?
Oh, absolutely. And that's another key is that and why these CLE courses are so important is because this is still in development, right? We are still evolving the way we understand trafficking. It's still nuanced by geography, but also we didn't have a lot of this information, and law enforcement was more likely to misidentify victims 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and continues to this day because of how clandestine the crime is, how difficult it is to identify.
So we're talking lastly about screening and interview techniques. We have about 5 minutes to finish up this 30-minute presentation because we always stick to 30 minutes. So let's talk about assure the victim. Let's talk about these last three or four boxes. What do you want to focus on there, Kimberly?
Well, I think that one, it's key to understand that individuals who are professionals in legal systems, they can absolutely have a higher likelihood of encountering individuals who may be trafficked. So when you're encountering these people, ensuring them that, regardless of what they disclose or what they choose not to disclose, they're not going to be in trouble. I think that's key, but it's also looking for resources to help them, documenting your findings. So keeping a record of your encounters. I've heard law enforcement, even when they're not encountering individual, when they can actually make an intervention, just documenting how the person looks, what is their affect, what do you see of as far as all these other indicators, right? And I think that that is key for any legal professional because you can develop your own sort of geographic specific indicia that you have seen within your community and in your profession. Because again, as I mentioned, it's going to be very nuanced. It's going to be very individualized. So documenting and understanding the types of individuals, the types of victims you're seeing. Are they sex trafficking victims? Are they labor trafficking victims? Are they adults? Are they minors? Because again, the indicia will be very different depending on the population. And as I mentioned, we still are developing the evidence base of, how reliable, what is the sensitivity and specificity of those indicia.
Okay, let's talk us through your website. If people go to this website at
Mm-hmm.
melmanorozco.com, I hope I said that correctly.
Yes.
Okay. What can people find on your website? What can they leverage? Why should someone look at this from you as an expert witness who testifies in these types of cases? And I believe you said trains law enforcement, correct?
Yes, I have trained law enforcement since around 2016 or so. If they go to the author tab, you can find opinion editorials, peer-reviewed journal articles, my book, but you can keep up to date on information that I'm publishing and writing about on human trafficking, in mostly in the United States, but to extent internationally. I've done some internationally speaking events as well. For expert witness services, I have served as an expert witness for prosecutors, at times for defense for erroneously criminalized victims. I have prevailed on Daubert challenges, so my testimony has been admitted in federal and state courtrooms across the country. I've even testified or been retained by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in the past. I do training, and my book is used to train law enforcement. I'm also in the process of training private companies on how they might encounter trafficking as well, online platforms, but also physical premises for various corporations around the world.
Wow. So for international corporations that might be accidentally using slave labor.
Well, so at time the overwhelming majority of corporations who encounter trafficking situations, it absolutely is unwitting. They don't realize what's going on. It's down their supply chain, or they're encountering these situations completely unwitting and unknown to them. Even if they really have gone above and beyond industry standards to identify, it's a clandestine crime. It's difficult to identify. But specifically with regards to Toolkit.law, is that a private business, because of the superficial nature of the interactions, they're not really well positioned to identify trafficking, right? They can't ask these invasive questions. They can't engage in a trauma informed interview. And that's why legal professionals are key, that when and if they encounter survivors of trafficking or potential trafficking situations, they have the ability to look further and to identify some of these more nuanced and difficult to identify indicia where a private business just, they are not positioned for that. It's not appropriate to ask these invasive questions.
Oh my stars, you just made me realize something. One of the things, one of the things that, you may have a corporate legal department, right? And you're just signing up for regular CLE. You could use these help sheets within your legal department. Or, say you're a giant oil company, or you're a mining company, or you're a food harvesting company, whatever it is, you could use these help sheets to deploy to your company to help employees be trauma informed, to be looking for these things. Oh my goodness, what a great help. We're out of time. Again, I want to point out to people to check out your book, Hidden in Plain Sight, America's Slaves of the New Millennium. We've been joined by Kimberly Mehlman-Orozco. Any last thought you want to share with people encountering this topic for the first time?
The only thing, my last, I guess, piece is just keep an eye on developments. We're continuing to develop knowledge and evidence based on how to identify. But the bottom line here is it is a pernicious and clandestine crime. It's difficult to identify. So just keeping your education up to date on nuanced innovations, I think, will be absolutely imperative moving forward.
And for those of us who are experienced attorneys, regardless which country we're in, we realize that it's not just our hard technical skills that make us great lawyers, like great direct examination, great discovery, great impeachment of hostile witnesses. It's also those soft skills that help us learn from the people. Like, for instance, an opposing attorney may share something that you can learn from. Maybe that opposing attorney, while in a highly contentious thing, said something intentionally or unintentionally of value, right? We need to have those soft learning skills and the humility to learn from anybody to make us a better attorney. And whenever we encounter unwittingly, unintentionally, or intentionally this evil, that we have the skills to save somebody's lives or save our clients' lives, or just do good when it's so easy to just walk past it, right? So
Absolutely.
anyway, Kimberly, thank you. And this concludes this presentation.